Okay, so just to move on from issues in relation to the malperformance of the Irish economy, we'll continue looking at taxation. And we finished up the last day looking at the incidence of taxation, who pays it. And we looked at the example of an inelastic good. The why is it when the minister puts a tax on a price of cigarettes, or a tax on a box of cigarettes, that the price rises by the full amount of the tax on the night of the budget. And much the same happens for petrol. The minister announces an increase in excise duty on fuel, and the price rises by almost the full amount. It has to do with the elasticity of demand for the products. If he put the tax on an inelastic good, it wouldn't increase by the same amount. So back, I think, in about 2001, Charlie McCreevy in the budget announced an increase in excise duty on cider, but not on other alcohol. So I think he increased the cider, the equivalent, it came out at about 20 cents per pint of cider. And what happened in the aftermath of the budget is that Showerings came out, the producers of Bulmers, and announced that they weren't increasing the price of cider by 20 cents. That in fact, although the minister had increased excise duty, they were going to absorb the cost. Because cider on its own isn't an inelastic product. If there had been a 20-cent increase on all alcohols, well, alcohol as a product in general is probably inelastic. But it's likely people will substitute between different products in the market. So cider could have a substitute in beer, or a substitute in stout, or a substitute in spirits, a substitute in wine. So if the relative price of cider was increased, it could have led to a fall in demand. So what Showerings did, I think it was 2001, is that they observed the tax increase. It was still required, they were still required to pay over an extra 20 cents per pint sold. Whereas most times excise duties are increased, it's passed on to the consumer, the company collects the money of the consumer and then pays it on to the revenue. This was one instance where the tax wasn't passed on, and it has to do with the relative elasticities. So if a product is demand elastic, the tax won't tend to be passed on. So we finished up with a curve last day that would perhaps have shown that. What we're going to look at today is the welfare implications of taxation. So again, we're just going to use the basic supply and demand analysis, given what the supply and demand curve represent. The demand curve representing consumers' willingness to pay, and the supply curve shows the cost of production. So how much must a company get to cover its cost of production? That's represented by the supply curve. How much is a consumer willing to pay based on the utility he'll get from the product? That's what the demand curve shows us. So we look at the outcome in different settings. Initially a no tax setting, and then we'll add tax to the product. So again, just looking at basic supply and demand. So we've got price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. So we'll just start with a typical downward sloping demand curve. We won't make any specific assumptions about the elasticity. We'll just take it to be perhaps approaching a 45-degree line in a typical downward sloping demand curve. And the same with supply. So again, the demand curve representing the consumer's margin willingness to pay. What price would the consumer be willing to pay for the next unit? So at very low quantities, consumers are willing to pay a high price. But as consumers get more and more of the product, their margin willingness to pay declines. Either consumers who don't particularly enjoy the product must have a sufficiently low price to buy it, or those who've enjoyed the early units, because of diminishing margin utility, are only willing to pay a lower and lower price for subsequent units. And then we'll just assume the typical short-run upward sloping supply curve, that in order to supply more, the firm's cost will increase, be it cost of raw materials, cost of capital, cost of labour, through overtime, through extra rates to be paid. The short-run supply curve we tend to assume is upward sloping. So we look for our market equilibrium. So we'll say we call it position E1, price P1, quantity Q1. So that's our initial position, our starting position, equilibrium position. No intervention in the market. The market will naturally be drawn by Adam Smith's invisible hand to the market equilibrium. If we look at a market intervention, so we'll assume the government imposes a per unit tax on supply. So there's some product the government decides to impose a tax on, and we'll just impose it in a monetary amount. So again, the tax shifts the supply curve and shifts the supply curve vertically. You can consider the tax to be like an additional cost. The government imposed the tax on the supplier, and instead of just having raw material costs, labour costs, capital costs, plant and machinery costs, to produce and sell an additional unit of output, the firm now has a tax cost, some monetary amount per unit sold. When it comes to imposing taxes on goods, it doesn't matter whether you impose the tax on suppliers or demanders. The outcome will be exactly the same. The legal incidence could be completely different. You could ask suppliers to pay you the tax. You could ask demanders, buyers to pay you the tax. The outcome will be exactly the same. So in general, the tax is placed on the supplier because of administrative issues. Easier to collect, and there is a paper trail. Plus, by forcing them to pay the tax, you force them to submit tax returns, and you can actually see what's happening in the economy. So the tax caused the supply curve to rise. Get the gap right. And we have a new supply curve. It's parallel to the original one. We call it S plus T. But it's some amount of tax higher than the original supply curve. So what happens in the market setting? Well, again, equilibrium will just occur where supply equals demand. So to find what happens is fairly straightforward. Here's our new supply curve. Cut the demand curve. Consumer behaviour hasn't changed. Consumers are still willing to pay the same price for the product. It's just they're facing different supply conditions. So we have a new equilibrium. We call it E2. So we price P2 and quantity Q2. So what has happened in the market? Well, you can see the price has risen. P2 is greater than Q2. P2 is greater than P1. And the quantity has fallen. Although perhaps not by a huge amount. So when it comes to the price, you see the price has risen. Look at the quantity has fallen. So we'll just mark off a couple of areas. So this triangle here we'll call A. This rectangle here we'll call B. Small triangle in there we'll call C. We'll also bring a line out from where the quantity line crosses the original supply curve. So that's where the quantity line crosses the original supply curve. We call that price P3. So we have A, B, C. We call this rectangle here D. Small little triangle out here E. And this whole area here at the bottom F. So what happens to the market outcome? Well, if we take the original position E1, what is the welfare outcome at the original equilibrium where the price is P1 and the quantity is Q1? So consumers are paying price P1. There would have been consumers willing to pay a far higher price as given along the demand curve. These consumers are all getting a surplus. The demand curve shows us the utility they get from using the product. The price line shows us the cost they must incur. So they're enjoying a surplus, which you tend to call consumer surplus. So at E1, the original position, consumer surplus is A plus B plus C. It's the area above the price line, below the demand curve. There's triangle A, rectangle B, there's a triangle out here, area C. What about our firms at equilibrium E1? can see that some firms will be willing to supply for low prices, given the low points on the supply curve, but they're selling in the market at price P1. So clearly there's a surplus that some firms are making, an excess of the price they're willing to supply for, is given by the supply curve, and the price they do supply for is given by P1. So producer surplus, which in the long run is equivalent to profit, but may not necessarily be the case in the short run, is D plus E plus F. That's the area below the price line above the supply curve. So when it's when it's E1 before the tax, we're looking at supply curve S. So welfare is the sum of all of those, A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. And in a perfectly competitive market, that is the maximum amount of welfare that can be created. There is no price-quantity combination that leads to a higher area of welfare. You can perhaps look at the distribution, the effect of it, who gets the welfare, but A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F is the highest amount of welfare. Firms could perhaps try to capture more the consumer surplus with price discrimination, but that's just simply a transfer from one group to the other. What we're looking at is an intervention by the government, where the government tries to capture some of this surplus. So this is extra benefit these people are getting from participating in the market. The surplus for consumers from buying and use the product ahead of the price they pay, and the surplus for producers from making and selling the product over the cost they incur. So we have consumer surplus and producer surplus. So the government says, look, we'd like to capture a bit of this. We're looking to supply goods and services in the economy. We need a source of revenue. We're going to impose a tax on this product. So they're going to set a tax at T, whatever it might be, and cause the supply curve to shift. So we've seen the supply curve shift to S plus T. Let's look at the welfare outcome when the tax is in place. So if we look at consumer surplus, what is consumer surplus under the tax regime? The definition doesn't change. Consumer surplus is the area above the price line below the demand curve. Consumers are now paying price P2. The demand curve has stayed the same. So consumer surplus is area A. So consumer surplus is area A. If we look at producer surplus, and this is where this price P3 comes into play, even though the consumer is paying price P2, the producer doesn't get to keep it all. That's the price they charge the consumer, but that's now split into two parts. There's the part the producer gets to keep to cover his costs and earn a profit, and there's the part he must hand over to the revenue commissioners, the excise duty on the product. So the tax is the vertical distance between the two supply curves, T, whatever it might be. And that's the same here. That line here is vertical, so we drew it out here. So P3 is essentially the price on which the firm's profits are based. It's not going to earn profit by collecting tax. It collects 50 cents and pays revenue 50 cents. It's just money flowing around. What is important is how much money is left after it pays the tax. So P3 is what we might call the retained price. How much does the firm get to keep? And again, the definition of producer surplus stays the same. The area above the supply curve, below the market price. So we can compare P3 to the firm's original costs, because after P3 the tax has been paid, so we can just ignore the tax. So producer surplus is area F. Once the producer has paid over the tax, he gets to keep P3. What cost of production does he incur? That's given by the supply curve S. So producer surplus is area F. So are these now the only beneficiaries from the market? We've gone from a situation where welfare was A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. We're now in a situation where we're saying welfare is A plus F. Well, there's an additional benefit from the market that doesn't accrue to consumers, doesn't accrue to producers. It's a tax collected by the government. So the government gets to collect an amount of tax. So the government collects tax T, or P2 minus P3, this distance here, on each unit sold, or this distance here, whatever way you look at it, and it collects it for Q2 units. So for each unit sold, it collects this amount of tax, and it collects it over Q2 units. So this area here represents the tax. And you can work out the value of it. The area is height by length. You can also work out consumer surplus and producer surplus. But the tax is B plus D. And in this instance, the tax is split between the consumer and the producer. The consumer is paying tax equal to area B because the price the consumer pays is increased from P1 to P2. The producer is paying tax equal to area D because the price he gets to retain has fallen from P1 to P3. So unlike the situation with cigarettes which are demand inelastic, in this instance the tax is split between the two of them. The producer passes some of the tax on but absorbs the rest. So we'll assume that the taxation collected adds to welfare. It's not necessarily welfare in this market, but it's welfare in the economy, welfare in the society. But the government collects this tax revenue and spends it elsewhere, either on providing goods and services, on social transfers, on public sector pay, whatever it may be. So the tax revenue isn't a loss per se, it's just simply a transfer out of this market into other markets. The full impact will be done under a general equilibrium model. But we can look at welfare in the post-tax situation. It's A for consumer surplus, F for producer surplus, and B plus D for taxation. So this is now the welfare generated by the market in the post-tax situation. So consumers are still benefiting, producers are still benefiting, and the government is collecting a bit in taxation. Of course, the issue is now, is what happens to area C plus E? This bit out here at the end. This formed part of welfare before. C went to the consumer as part of consumer surplus, and E went to firms as part of producer surplus. When the tax is imposed, who's collecting those? Well, in fact, nobody collects those. Those are lost. So this little triangle out here, area C plus E, is actually lost to society because of the tax. The tax imposes a cost over and above the amount of revenue collected. Why does the tax incur a cost or create a cost? Well, it's because quantity falls. We go from Q1 to Q2. So society loses out. Why does society lose out? Well, at point E1, the cost of production and the benefits are equal. The supply curve crosses the demand curve. How much factors of production was going to make in the product, how much benefit does society get from using the product. At point E1, they're equalized. If you look at point E2 and quantity Q2, the cost of production of making the product are on the original supply curve or down here. The value consumers get from using the product are on the demand curve up there. The benefits exceed the costs. In fact, society could increase consumption up to Q1 and the benefits would continue to exceed the costs. The issue is the tax has driven a wedge between costs and benefits. It's no longer simply a decision, how many factors of production we have to use to make this product, and then what benefit do consumers get from it. The tax now, in a sense, muddies the waters. It drives a wedge between the two. And that's this gap here. So if the tax didn't exist, society would be better off increasing production. So the tax creates a dead weight loss. And this is what Adam Smith referred to as efficiency in his canons of taxation. Why is there this inefficiency? Why is there this loss of welfare? Well, people stop buying this product. They go from Q1 to Q2 and perhaps start buying another product. Welfare is maximised and can't be made any greater if Q1 units of this product are bought. If only Q2 units are bought because of taxation, well then welfare is no longer maximised. So the taxes impose a welfare loss. So consumer surplus is down, producer surplus is down, and tax revenue is up. However, the decrease in consumer and producer surplus is not equal to the increase in tax, and some welfare is lost. While the government captures some of the welfare in the market, it doesn't capture it all. So this is referred to as the deadweight loss or the excess burden of taxation. So the excess burden is defined as the amount that's lost in excess of what the government collects. And again, as I said at the start, it's the same regards to the legal incidents. You can't eliminate the deadweight loss by putting the tax on consumers. The outcome will be the same whether you put the tax on consumers or producers. So really the objectives of a tax system is try to minimise this excess burden, try to minimise the cost the tax system puts on society. But collecting tax revenue does cause an excess burden. So we'll leave it at that for today. I will take it up with tax evasion and tax avoidance